Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to YASCP, your African Supply Chain Podcast. I am your host, Stella Jaqueta. And in this podcast, we discuss various topics that affect my beautiful, your beautiful, uncomplicated African supply chain. And in this episode, we will be talking about why cultural awareness training matters in supply chains. And I have a wonderful, power-packed guest, and his name is Danilo de Souza Nhantumbo. Danilo is an experienced Mozambican executive with over 15 years experience in international business. His work has encompassed energy, telecoms, fintech, and agriculture. Danilo is trained translator, inductee of Phi Kappa Phi, correct me if I'm wrong, Honor Society, and a proud member of the University of Maryland Alumni Association. He brings knowledge of corporate strategy, regulatory compliance, government relations, contract management, intercultural communication, and tech to the table. And along with his background in entrepreneurship and foreign direct investment in Africa. So first of all, Danilo, once again, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. And how are you doing?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Yes, thank you so much, Danilo. So just to get started on the first question that now we're talking about why cultural awareness training actually matters, but can you please define it to us? What is it, cultural awareness training?
I mean, it's a pretty broad term, right? And it's kind of implied in the title. Culture in itself is something that is extremely stratified and it can be defined in many ways. But on a very basic level, we're talking about understanding what are the things that people do within a given environment, whether that's an organization, how do they do them, why do they do them, and in this case, when we talk about Africa as a whole, we're discussing a continent of 54 nations, right? And within these nations, there are multiple cultures within each country, right? In Mozambique alone, as an example, we already divide our country into North, Central, and South. And within those divisions, Manica is very different than Sofala, right? Like the Ndau people are very different than the Shimanika, Shona kind of people, right? So understanding the cultural differences and similarities amongst peoples is crucial to getting along, right? And making sure that whatever the end game or the bottom line of a company is, whatever their targets are actually achieved, and that you don't let cultural differences get in the way of achieving goals.
Yes, I like what you say that it's about not having the cultural differences actually impacting on the strategy of the company itself and what they actually want to achieve. And it's so interesting. One of the points that you touch is that within the country, there's actually cultural differences, and that actually affects the way you do the business. Because sometimes we may say, "All right, Mozambique or Angola or Brazil, it's all the same since they speak Portuguese. Right. So the culture should be the same. I should just put all my products in Portuguese and we're fine. But now it impacts within the country, you have cultural differences, right?
Absolutely. You mentioned there, Brazil and how different it is than, say, Mozambique or Angola, as well as Portugal, right? And Brazil is also another nation that is enormous. The difference between the culture in Bahia versus the culture in Curitiba, completely different societies within one country and completely different ways of going about business and marketing. And the same applies to managing a supply chain and understanding the kind of people who are going to be working within that supply chain.
Yes. And Danilo, we often hear about the monochromatic and polychromatic cultures in the Western and the Eastern cultures. And one is more cold and transactional. The other one is more relationship and respect based. Do you think here in Africa, just talking about, let's say, the different regions here in Africa, right? Let's say Southern and Eastern Africa and West Africa, do you think that plays into affecting how people do business, and what type of those two kinds of cultures actually play here more?
I think there's a bit of both, right? So you have both the mono and the polychronic situation in terms of, just for the audience, monochronic means, you basically do one thing at a time, right? So if you're given 10 tasks, you do them sequentially. You do task one, then task two, then task three. And if you're poly, you do maybe task one and three at the same time in parallel, then you do two and six, or whatever order you might deem as essential. Um, so it's about, essentially multitasking or focusing on one thing at a time. I don't want to consider us a monolith where, especially not having lived or worked in all of these different 54 nations.
Yeah.
Um, I think that there's definitely a certain level of deference that we provide to elders and to leaders of organizations. Um, and the technical term in sociology is power difference, right? So there's definitely a power difference between employee levels, right? So if
Yeah.
you are, at a company in the West, you might have a lot more access to not necessarily leadership, per se, in terms of, you're not going to maybe have a chance to speak to the CEO on a daily basis,
Yeah.
but, through HR or through other departments, you can get your point across, right? You can potentially even whistleblow if you're suffering some kind of abuse or some kind of, or you hear about something negative that's happening in the company. A small, um, or nah, small is the wrong term. A person that is not necessarily very high up in the company can have a large impact on the company. And in places like Mozambique, I won't say the whole of Africa, that becomes a little bit more difficult because the systems aren't in place for that communication to get from bottom to the top, right?
Yes.
The power distance is really, really great. Which is fine. That's just a cultural thing. We just need to figure out how to bridge that gap in terms of communication, even if the power distance is separate. So I think that is more of an issue than the way that people work. I'm somebody who grew up in Mozambique, but also grew up in the UK. I have both cultures within
Yes.
me, and those things sometimes clash, but sometimes they dovetail really well. So I don't necessarily feel like it's impossible for people that worked in different ways to be able to achieve goals together. I think it's just a matter of understanding. If you are somebody who needs to do things one by one, step by step, that's perfectly fine. If you want to multitask and do various things at the same
True.
time, that's also cool. You just have to understand who you're working with and be respectful of the way that other people function.
Yes, that's very true. And Danilo, why do you think now global companies with a vast and complex supply chain, right? They have operations in multiple countries, in multiple continents. Why do you think they need to have and invest in this cultural awareness training? Because again, you spoke about the power distance in terms of, let's say someone whistle blows. Let's say you are a company, you're a subsidiary in Mozambique of a big corporation in the US. How do you make them aware that, okay, there's something wrong down here that you can escalate and not actually have repercussion going back or backfiring to them? So why do you think it's so important for companies to invest in that?
I think it's crucial. There was an interesting case in Kenya, if I'm not mistaken, a few months ago. An entity that was providing services to Meta, formerly Facebook's parent company. Um, that I think they did kind of call centers, but also they reviewed content, right? So they basically had to identify content that should not be, you know, distributed,
Appropriate,
whether
yeah.
that's, you know, all this kind of negative stuff that gets put on the internet. So you had people who were reviewing this really sometimes disturbing content, and they were whistleblowing internally in terms of some issues that they were facing, whether that was mismanagement or not getting paid for overtime or not getting any kind of mental health support for all of the crazy stuff that they were having to bear witness to. Um, and that didn't really function very well in terms of reaching out to the company in Kenya. They tried to whistleblow to Facebook, but Facebook, the parent company, also, it was kind of part of their strategy to offload this.
Mm.
And I don't want you to get sued. This is allegedly part of their strategy to outsource this kind of work, so they didn't
Yeah.
have to deal with these kinds of issues internally. So until it became published in the news, it wasn't dealt with either by the local company or the parent company, right? So you do have instances where there is a lack of understanding on the cultural side of how comfortable people are going to be doing a certain kind of work, right? Um, you had a situation where Facebook felt that they could easily offload this work to an African country where people, oh, they're not going to mind
True.
viewing this kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
we don't have to. And because we are outsourcing this from a company, they're not our employees, so we don't have to pay them, even though they are getting paid very, very poorly for work that if you did that in the U.S., you would get paid a lot more, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's also important is valuing the work that people do all the way through the supply chain, understanding that, okay, there are different economic situations and it's kind of hard to pay a Kenyan the same as you would pay an American. But um, for me, it was an example of a company not understanding Kenyan culture, not understanding the diversity of culture within Kenya itself, um, and being almost surprised when there was whistleblowing and thinking, oh, we found out, we're just going to keep it quiet, and being shocked when it actually reached the newspapers and became a global news story. And then having to then, turn around and try and, quell all of the anxiety that came from the public. So, yeah, I think it's crucial to have a global strategy on, on culture, but also understanding, um, that as a company, you can't just expect things to be one way, um, or the way that you expect them to be. You have to always be on your toes and you have to be open to whistleblowing.
True. And the thing is, the mentality or the thought is that I just want to ship my goods. I don't want to deal with cultural barriers. For example, let's paint a picture right here where there is a market, suppose in Mozambique, there is a market, there is a demand for my product, and it's all good. They want it. And okay, I just need to put my office there and it's fine. I don't need to adapt and even translate the requirements of my products. It's just I'm dumping into that country basically. But I just because what I just transactional. I don't want to deal with the backstory. I don't want to know how if there is kickbacks, even corruption, or how the Mozambicans actually do business, because I know there is a demand for my product. But do you think in those type of scenarios, do companies still fail when they go with that mentality, or do you think, oh, there's a demand for that product, then they should be fine?
That's a really good question. I think it's a profound question in the sense that it depends, right? If you come in with an inelastic product that isn't available, right, that you're the only person supplying it, you might not need to adapt your product, especially if it's something that's in demand, right? Say if you are the only person supplying, diesel and petrol, and you're the only supplier in the country, you might not need to make all that much of an effort to even um, change it. That being said, as soon as other players start coming in, you need to, and they start marketing their product specifically for certain groups, and they understand that certain people require um, certain incentives to become a customer. You start seeing some change. I think a good example of this is how Netflix expanded globally, and they spent so much money and time researching culture of different countries, but also putting a lot of money into the translation and the localization of
Mhm.
their subtitling, making sure that across various markets you are able to not just source content, but also distribute content. So you open in India, you want to sell US and European and African shows to the Indian market, and you want to make it available in the many, many languages of India, but you also want to make sure that Indian content producers know that, okay, they do this here. That means that somebody in Mozambique can watch this in Portuguese with English subtitles, even dubbed in different languages as well. So I think that's one of the more interesting examples of going global and understanding how to communicate to your customers. Obviously, their supply chain is completely different than, say, somebody who is shipping a physical product.
True.
And sometimes it feels, for a company, let's say you are a toy maker, right? And you feel like, if I only have limited space on my packaging, I can't translate this into various languages. I'm going to do the bare minimum, whether that's to a WTO standard, the ISO standard, or or the EU or the US or whatever, to be able to export your product. You see, if you go to Game or somewhere in Mozambique, there are so many products that are not translated into Portuguese, right? That you don't necessarily, you and I will be able to pick it up off the shelf and know what the ingredients are, if it's safe for our children or so forth, but other people might not. So that also is a something that is about government regulation and making sure that you put things in place that, if you want to export here, you need to follow these parameters, which of course, if it comes at a cost, then you have to see how many people are going to follow through with that, considering the actual demand in a place like Mozambique. So there's always a trade-off.
Yes, no, that's very true. And there's something that I actually want to connect with my next question is, now we have a lot of talks in terms of strategy and African development, right? And we have the AFCTA, the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, where wants basically join Africa in terms of trade, right? And it's painting this picture of Africa as as a single market. We can become a single market. We can, for Mozambique, you can trade with Nigeria, you can trade with Ghana easily, right? So do you think, since it's being painted as that, or it's being packaged as that, do you think cultural training will still become very relevant still, or are we gonna become, how can I say, become one more or less? Or do you still think that we're still gonna have, even though we're different countries, we're still gonna have to learn how to deal with each other, basically?
I think we'll have to learn how to deal with each other, but I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying about regulation and putting things in place, systems and mechanisms in place to facilitate the work, automate some of the work that needs to be done at border posts or at the factory. When you are doing your packaging, you know exactly what the packaging standard is for all of Africa. So if you are a Nigerian producer and you want to ship your product within Nigeria, then to Ghana, then to Mozambique, then to Mauritius, and all these countries that speak different languages, um, or to a country that uses a different script, say an Arabic script, which means you have to change the way that you're printing, right? It goes in a different direction. Um, all of these things need to be taken into account to make it easier for the producers and the people who are managing the supply chains to have an easier job. Um, that said, I think that the CTA is great. It's a great concept. I think that there's obviously, it's still very early stages, and we need to do a lot of work in terms of infrastructure. You compare it to the European Union, when the name a free trade area, all of those countries had pretty solid infrastructure already. They were already
Yes.
trading in a pretty solid way, and it's a much smaller geographical area, so it's a lot easier to deal with in terms of building infrastructure that goes from from France to Belgium to Luxembourg to Germany and otherwise. Um, so there are a lot of limitations still, but I think it's still very early, and I think there will be progress made. There will be teething problems, but we'll get there.
Yeah, no, I believe so. And I'm actually looking forward to that. And as professionals, and this is kind of getting to my last question, is as supply chain professionals or as professionals in general, right? As we are moving into a more global, well, the pandemic showed us that countries should are nationalizing most of the things, but well, we were on the path of being global, everyone being a global community, global employee, basically. Do you think that we should, if your company doesn't invest in cultural training, should I still do it myself and look at learning other cultures in that sense? Or should I just, or is it just something that you learn on the go, like as in you're there, you're placed in a certain country, or you are having to deal with, let's say, Japanese supplier, or you have to deal with an American supplier, and you just learn as you go? Or can I actually take steps to not preempt that, so learn before I actually have to deal with them?
I would say so. Yes, absolutely. I think it's both important to do your due diligence ahead of time. If you are in your early 20s and you want to have a global career, and say you're working in Mozambique, but you're looking to work in mentioned Japan, or you want to work in South America, or with Japanese companies or South American companies, you need to spend some time and educate yourself. And it's a continual process, right? It needs to be not just one course. It needs to be immersing yourself in that culture, and not just homework. It doesn't have to necessarily be
Yeah,
all academic stuff. You can immerse yourself in through film and music and literature. There are many ways to expose yourself to different cultures and open your mind to different ways of thinking. So I would definitely encourage that. I think it's, you know, in terms of African development, we we have to continue to engage globally, as well as building, you know, continental wise. Um, there are, a great many developments on the digital front, especially with digital currencies. The Chinese central bank digital currency is going to be a huge player in how Africa moves forward. So
true.
I would definitely keep an eye on those kinds of things, what's happening with when it comes to supply chains, because the digital currencies will be the fuel to make those supply chains a lot more dynamic.
Perfect. And Danilo, has some of your closing remarks in terms of the culture awareness trainings? Can you please tell us like one of your last words of encouragement, basically? And can you please tell us a little bit more about your company as well, because you also deal with this, and how people can also reach out to you?
Sure. I think in terms of last words of encouragement, interesting. Um, I think, it's similar to what I mentioned before in terms of just immerse yourself in the work. Try to understand what the global supply chain looks like. There have been a lot of difficult moments, especially for Mozambique. We've had an economic crisis, followed by what's happening with COVID, and we have the instability in the north of the country, which encompasses violence as well as a lot of migration, forced migration of people. Um, there's a lot of work to be done to make Mozambique and many other African countries a lot more stable. And what I would say is that this is this is not unusual for humanity. We go through these
True.
peaks and valleys of, halcyon days, but also moments of immense trauma. So we need to keep pushing. And I think that, in terms of supply chains, we definitely need to build more um, robust infrastructure. We need to build skills as well, and then, dynamic skills. I think we need as many people who drive trucks as people who understand AI and understand how that's going to be incorporated in building adaptable supply chains in the future, who understand blockchain technology. So I think there's plenty of opportunity. And I'd also tell people that work in Mozambique that the world is your oyster. You don't have to stay in Mozambique. Nobody's
True.
obliging you to stay
Yes.
there. I know that it's not easy. I know I'm very fortunate to have experienced other parts of the world. Um, but I encourage anybody who is looking to do that to go for it. Apply for university or other education programs outside of Mozambique, and shoot for the stars. Apply for jobs outside of Mozambique, and train yourself in the language and cultural skills that you need to be able to go elsewhere.
Yeah, no, definitely. And Danilo, can you please speak a little bit more of your company and how people can find?
Sure. So I mean, there's my company, which is Navitas Group Global, and we do consultancy and advisory. A lot of that is in the foreign direct investment space. But I also work for eLivestock Global, which is one of the reasons that we connected, which is more related to the supply chain stuff that we're talking about today.
Yeah.
And we are a company that provides cattle health and traceability solutions through tech. So we are an agri-tech firm. We also work in the financial inclusion space, and we work with banks and fintechs to provide farmers with financial solutions by harnessing the value of their livestock as collateral and giving them access to financial services as well as insurance. You can find me on LinkedIn, Danilo Nhantumbo. That's my only social. And hit me up and we can communicate and keep on talking.
Yes. Thank you so much, Danilo. Hit him up. And for me, really, this cultural training and awareness, we don't have an excuse anymore. We are living in the information age where information is readily available for us, maybe sometimes too much information, but we have the information available to move forward. We cannot say that I do not know. There is someone somewhere that has published something in that space and that's talked about it. So we cannot say that I don't know because it was a misunderstanding. It is our obligation as professionals, as supply chain professionals, to know better, to investigate, to go look for the right information. So once again, Danilo, thank you very much. And thank you everyone who has listened to the podcast. Please rate, subscribe so that you can get our future episode notification. And thank you. I will see you on the next episode.